The first presidential debate takes place tomorrow night. Not only is the debate not sponsored by the Commission on Presidential Debates, there will be no live audience and microphones will be cut while a candidate is not speaking. KLTV's Michael Richardson has the breakdown of what you can expect during the conversation.
The first 2020 presidential debate is remembered for its interruptions and insults.
Would you shut up, man?
What happens when former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden once again take the stage will be answered tomorrow night in Atlanta. And for the first time since 1988, the Commission on Presidential Debates will not be sponsoring the conversation. UT Tyler Public Administration professor Dr. Ken Wink feels presidential debates do not have much of an impact.
I would challenge anybody, with the possible exception of 1960, to suggest that debates were determinative. I don't think that's true.
Not everyone vying for the White House will participate in the discussion, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Cornel West, Jill Stein, and Chase Oliver. The Biden campaign has centered its messaging on portraying Trump as a danger to democracy. Meanwhile, the Trump camp has sought to convey Biden as a weak commander-in-chief. How the candidates present themselves will be on many minds heading into the debate.
Does Trump act up? Are we gonna see a show? And two, does Biden really have it mentally? I mean, can he make it an entire hour and a half?
After months of campaigning, both candidates now take their message to an entire nation.
Both candidates better bring their A game, not make excuses, and be as civil as they possibly can.
Michael Richardson, KLTV 7 News.
The debate starts at 8 o'clock tomorrow night right here on Channel 7.